We're about to get started in just a couple minutes. We're waiting for some colleagues to get through security. So once they're able to join us, we'll get started. But I would say please take advantage of saying, I know you're seated and remain seated, but take advantage of saying hello to someone who you don't know. You know, we convene these events and we want to make sure you have an opportunity to network and get to know people. So the room is too quiet. So get to know someone before we get started.
So you're going to do Philippines? I was just there.
Oh, where were you?
I was in Luzon. I was writing about
awesome.
Duterte's Environment Secretary, Gina Lopez.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's on. In fact, I was writing for Manga Bay and China Dialogue and News 24 in South Africa.
Yeah.
And you know, I spent good time with her, man. What an interesting story. Did you follow that at all?
No, it's not the very least.
We're never going to get them back.
Well, you know, Duterte's got this really interesting social policy, social welfare, you know, quality of life thing going on there. It's really, you know, he wants to ban smoking, kill drug dealers, and protect the environment. This is an interesting strategy.
So have you written it down?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you send me the link?
Give me your card. I did a bunch of stories around her.
All right. Awesome.
She just got bounced by the legislature.
Great. Okay.
The mining companies went after her, and they just bounced her last week.
All right.
I went over to try to, you know, raise international profile.
Awesome.
She came out of Asia, this
Wow.
incredible environmentalist, closing mines.
I want to hear more about it.
Oh, it's amazing. It
sounds
was an amazing
fascinating.
freaking story.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, now that we've got you started, we're going to slow things down a little bit to get the panel started. So,
Are we going to speak over there?
welcome. It's good to have you join us this afternoon for our discussion on water and security in South and Southeast Asia. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, Director of Programs on Global Sustainability and Resilience here at the Wilson Center. And you know, many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center, but I think that, you know, when David Reed and colleagues at WWF approached us and asked us to think about doing a series of case studies and conversations about water and security globally, it just occurred to me that there really are moments in time when we as a global community are called to engage, to examine, to critically analyze, and to determine how to move forward on particular sets of issues. And it occurred to me that this is one of those times, and this set of issues is one set of issues that we need to look at a little bit more closely. And that's exactly what we do at the Wilson Center. Most recently, we were recognized yet again by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank globally for transdisciplinary research. And I think the topic that we're examining here together with our colleagues on the panel and at WWF is really a good reflection of that. You know that we serve as a living memorial to President Wilson, bringing together the worlds of policy and analysis and looking at practical application. And we do that through independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas. So in that context, I welcome you, and I hand you over to my colleague David Reed from WWF. Welcome.
Roger Mark, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And indeed, I must say, what a great honor, pleasure it has been working with the Woodrow Wilson Center in co-hosting this series of seminars on water and security. And many thanks to your colleagues, Roger Mark, for their assistance along the way. 5 years ago, 2012 exactly, the National Intelligence Council released its assessment of the state of the world's waters. That report was called Global Water Security. And its key judgment, as the intelligence community calls its findings, its key judgment is that in the next 10 years, water problems will contribute to instability in states of interest, of importance to the United States. And further, that key judgment stated that water problems will combine with other problems to create social disruptions that can lead to state failure. Now, WWF, as a global conservation organization, has found itself embroiled in many of these social disruptions. We have been invited by communities, cooperatives, government agencies, corporations across the world, asking how can we better understand these disruptions, what is driving them, and what can we do about them? And it is in that context of this rising demand for information and response that 2 years ago, WWF initiated a research program on water and security. And we wanted really to better understand what were the drivers of these social disruptions. How did they unfold? Who were the actors? What were the consequences? What were the impacts? And what were the significance of these for the US government and our interests around the world? So in launching the study in 14 geographies, we are now at a point of being able to share with you some of those lessons. All of the 14 geographies have experienced significant ecological change, very often water-driven ecological change in recent years. And those studies covered a wide geographic range for countries in Central America, Nigeria, the Arc of Instability, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and on to the geography that we'll be exploring today. And those changes, water-driven social disruptions, have been expressed through drought, flood, depletion of aquifers, extreme weather events, and other experiences. And indeed, in doing this research program, we wanted to know exactly what impacts did these ecological changes, water-driven ecological changes, have on human systems, on the economy, on world livelihoods, on infrastructure, on healthcare systems, on governance arrangements. Second, we wanted to understand how have communities, how have social groups responded to these social disruptions? What has been the response of economic and political elites, the rural poor, urban dwellers, government agents? And finally, we wanted to understand how these roll up into threats, into challenges to US security interests, and how then can we respond to these. Our basic assumption in organizing this research program is that US prosperity and national security depends on the prosperity and the stability of both partner countries and competing countries around the world. And so today we are going to explore these dynamics in the context of South Asia, Southeast Asia. We will be releasing the studies in a book form on June 27th here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The title of the book is Water, Security, and U.S. Foreign Policy, and we certainly invite you all to attend. But today we have the great pleasure, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Dr. Claudia Sadoff, who is currently serving as the World Bank's global lead for water security and integrated water resource management. During her many years at the World Bank, she has coordinated important initiatives, particularly dealing with water issues in Africa and Asia. And then most recently, she has led a team of researchers in exploring a research program linking water security and state fragility. And indeed, I think that that work is called Turbulent Waters, and I believe copies of which are on the table outside there. And I also invite you, as you leave, then to please take copies of the summaries of all the case studies we're looking at today, as well as the executive summary of the book. So with that, I turn it over to your very capable hands, and thank you so much, Claudia.
Thank you, David and Roger Mark. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to see so many people interested in this important topic. I know that the work that we're discussing today has very much a focus on connections to U.S. interests in the world. The World Bank, of course, has a very strong focus on development in developing countries, and we're concerned about the ways in which water and water security are affecting development in our client countries in the developing world. Specifically, we're very concerned about the impacts of fragility, conflict, and violence on development, economic growth, and human well-being. We know that today about 2 billion people in the world are living in countries whose context is affected by fragility, conflict, or violence. We anticipate that by 2030, roughly 50% of the world's poor will live in conflict or fragility-affected environments. So what we see is that the context of poverty and the challenge of poverty is moving very much into this fragile space that we need to learn to deal with. Specifically with regard to water, what we find is that in fragile or fragility-affected contexts, most citizens have about half of the access to water numbers than they do in non-fragile states, and that progress toward the Millennium Development Goals in fragile states was only about half the rate that it was in fragile states. This is where the poor will be, this is where the infrastructure stocks are low, and this is where progress is very slow. We feel that a lot of the countries that are being left behind are exactly these countries. We need to learn to operate more effectively in them to assist those populations with their aspirations for development. The World Bank, as you may know, has a funding window called the International Development Association, IDA, which is a 3-year rolling set of grants. And in the IDA 18 allocation, which begins this summer, the World Bank has committed to doubling the development assistance that we will provide to these conflict, fragile, and violence-affected states, recognizing just what a challenge this is. Particularly within the water practice, our concerns arise because of the dynamics between water and fragility, as David was saying. I'm sure you're all familiar with the World Economic Forum's risk surveys that come out periodically, and last year, water crises were ranked as the top risk globally, perceived risk globally, in the coming 10 years. In the coming 18 months, it was a different list, and that list focused very much on fragility and violence and conflict, where we see this confluence of a water challenge and fragility, where those medium-term and those immediate risks are most intertwined, we have a tremendous challenge. What we believe we see is that when governments fail to provide basic water services to their people, when they fail to protect their people against water extremes like drought or flood, when they fail to preserve water resources from contamination or capture by elites or transboundary water riparians, we see that there's a potential loss of legitimacy for governments. We see that there's a potential for other parties to exploit those failures to deepen stability or to deepen perceptions of disenfranchisement within countries, to deepen feelings of exclusion and aggravate fragility in the countries that we work in. So we see a very vicious cycle between the challenge of trying to provide water security in these fragile contexts and the extreme cost of failing to provide water security in those fragile contexts. So we, all of us, as water or development or security practitioners, we need to find better ways to disrupt those vicious cycles and to try to do more and do better work in these countries to design and prioritize water programs that will help contribute not only to development and prosperity, but to stability in many of these countries. So this is an issue that is very, very near to my heart. I think it's one that's increasingly important and that we increasingly need to rise to address. We have a fantastic panel here today to begin to go into much more depth about these dynamics in the different countries that have been studied under David's leadership. We have our first speaker, who is Keith Schneider. He is the senior editor-in-chief correspondent for Circle of Blue, which is a very well-known online news agency that covers global water issues. He is an international correspondent and reporting regularly on water, energy, food, and the economy from 6 continents. And he will be speaking to us today about the energy-water nexus in the Indian Himalayas specifically. I'll introduce all 3 and then call you each up. Our second speaker will be Michael Kugelman, who is the Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center here, and he's also the center's Senior Associate for South Asia. He's responsible for research programming and publications across South Asia and will be speaking to us today about water security in Pakistan. The final speaker will be Roger Mark D'Souza, who is the Director of Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience for the Wilson Center. He leads the programs on climate change resilience, reproductive and maternal health, environmental security, and livelihoods, including the Global Sustainability and Resilience Program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, and the Maternal Health Initiative. A very light portfolio there, and he will speak to us today on water scarcity, ethnic conflict, and security in Mindanao, the Philippines. So without further ado, I would like to invite Keith Schneider to come and speak to us about the energy and water nexus in the Indian Himalayas.
Thank you, Claudia. Can you guys hear me? Really nice to be here. Thank you, David, for inviting me. And great day to be in Washington, D.C., a magnificent day in this magnificent capital. Let me give you a little bit about me so that you have kind of a context. I've had this privilege over the last 9 years now to travel the world for Circle of Blue and to write about the contest for water, energy, and food globally, and how it's affecting economies, how it's affecting rural cultures, how it's affecting agriculture, how it's affecting national governments. And one of the places that I've visited quite a lot is India. So I've been there 5 times since 2012. Each time I go, I spend about a month, and the last time I was there was in January in Tamil Nadu. And India has helped me kind of understand how to encapsulate what's happening in the world. And as a journalist, what we try to do is make the complex simple, and we try to find, core kernel nuggets about describing what we're doing. And my one word for describing what's happening in the world now is disruption. We're in a great era of disruption, and things are happening that we've never seen before, we don't expect, and that have tremendous impacts. And it's helped me develop a narrative about India and India's place in the world. And India has changed significantly in the 5 years since I started going there in 2012. And when I first was in India in 2012, being there a month left me convinced that I was in the midst of bedlam. I mean, if those of you who have been to India know how much commotion, the density of population, the crazy kinds of decisions that people have to make to lead their lives, the counterproductive resource strategies that they have in which they use their natural resources for social welfare uses, was to me significantly inefficient. And the result when we first got there in 2012 was that the GDP of India was falling from 10% early in the century to under 4% when we were there in 2012. And it was clear to me that India was facing a reckoning. They were facing a reckoning on how to begin to respond to the new conditions of the 21st century from the way that they were developing on 20th century conditions. And the reason that was occurring is because they were beginning to understand that they had no other choice. They're growing 25 million people a year. They have endemic poverty. They have great ambition. And as we've noted here earlier, the earth has been pushing India really hard with droughts, really hard with floods, really hard with typhoons, which was affecting all facets of their economy in every part of the country. So it came to me that India was in dire need of a new operating program. It wasn't clear when they would develop their new operating program. But for me as a journalist, I began to develop a kind of unified thesis of the world, which I want to describe before I get into the specifics of what we found in India, all of which have to do with water quantity, water access to water. And there are 2 ways that I describe this. One is scientific and one is sort of political economic. So what's happening in the world today is that the maximum power principle is confronting the law of minimum growth. The maximum power principle is a 20th century scientific formula which says that biological systems, human systems, economic systems will seek to grow, to expand to its maximum power until it confronts the law of minimum growth, which is a 19th century concept. And that says that these systems will expand until they meet the one ingredient which causes their growth to stop. And in the 20th century, around the world, that one ingredient is water. The second way to describe this political economic way is what I call the clash of 2 centuries. So the 20th century development strategy, which was based on the conditions that existed in the 20th century, which came to full presence in the United States and Western Europe, was a development strategy that was ecologically indifferent,
It wasted resources. It was high energy consuming. It believed in economies of scale, so we have mega projects, mega dams, mega power plants, mega highways, mega cities, mega suburbs. Government wealth was increasing in the 20th century, and so were personal incomes, so there was money, and so was a governing strategy in which we would invest in public purposes, public investments, roads, water systems, in the United States, to develop what we now call the drive-through economy. Populations were smaller, we had ample resources and there were much less competition for those resources, land prices were down, and the environment wasn't nearly as disruptive as it is today. In the 21st century, every one of those conditions has flipped over, every single one of them. Energy is expensive, land is expensive. There are twice as many people on the planet as there were in the 1970s. Government wealth has shrunk and personal incomes are down, and government's willingness to pay for public purposes is way down. Resources are scarcer, competition for them is higher. People are much better organized, particularly in the rural areas, than they ever were before, to battle the mega projects, the mega mines, the mega hydropower projects, the mega coal fields, the mega coal-fired power plants than they ever were before. And the earth is pushing back really hard now. Floods, heat, storm, drought, plagues, earthquakes, tsunamis, a lot of them have to do with water. So you have the clash of the 20th century development strategy and the impediments of the 21st century conditions that is changing how nations respond to water scarcity, water supply. And India is a big nation that has finally begun to recognize this and is moving much faster than I ever believed, and much faster probably than most Indians believe. So let me go through the sort of the chapters of how of this narrative that came to me as I traveled to India. The first one is sort of the cycles of risk that I encountered. So we went to Punjab and Haryana. Punjab and Haryana are the two states in northwestern India, the biggest agricultural states. And in both of those states, resources, particularly electricity and water, are free to farmers. So the pumps, the water pumps go all day long. And it drains the aquifers and it produces huge surpluses. So when we were there, 62 million metric tons of rice was moldering under plastic tarps in burlap sacks 2 and 3 stories tall in every national depot, grain depot in those two states. The numbers of pumps in those two states had grown from a few thousand in the 50s to millions. So half the electricity in Punjab and Haryana at certain times of the year, planting and harvest, were being used to pump water out of depleting aquifers. Then we went to Chhattisgarh, which is in central eastern India, which is the second largest coal mining state, to look at where was all this electricity and all the fuel being produced. And we found there, the largest open pit coal mine in Asia. We found coal-fired power plants being built pretty much all over that state. But India was suffering these tremendous brownouts and blackouts because it couldn't mine enough coal to power these new power plants. The power plants weren't operating efficiently because they didn't have enough coal, and 27% of the electricity that was being sent over those electrical lines was being wasted. So you had this incredible cycle of risk and inefficiency in which on one side they're wasting water, and on the other side they can't mine enough and produce enough electricity to power the country. And it was affecting their GDP. As I said, 4%, GDP had declined 4%. So I'm thinking, what is happening in India that they're beginning to respond? Well, at that point, 2012, 2013, they hadn't begun to respond. And in 2013, I went to Uttarakhand in the Himalayas. Uttarakhand, 5 minutes. Uttarakhand is where India was trying to expand the number of electricity generating sources through hydropower. And Uttarakhand was where India was going to make this big change in hydropower development. Well, in June 2013, Uttarakhand suffered an incredible flood, the largest flood ever measured in the Himalayas. Killed 30,000 people. We didn't hear about this flood in the West. It tore down 1,000 kilometers of roadway. It was caused by a foot of rain falling overnight in the Alaknanda and Mandakini River valleys, which are the headwaters of the Ganges. And I was interested in going, and I got there in 2012 in December, 2013 in December, to see what happened in the hydroelectric field. Well, it knocked out 10 dams. It washed away dams. It buried dams under boulders the size, that would fill this room. And what it showed me is that India's ability to be able to diversify its electricity sector in hydropower wasn't going to happen, because that flood was like the Fukushima for hydropower in the Himalayas and India. And hydropower development has basically come to a standstill in the Himalayas. And I went to this dam in the lower Subansiri Dam in Assam, which is between Calcutta and Bangladesh in the mountains, where citizens had stopped a 2,000 megawatt dam from being built halfway through. So the lower Subansiri Dam is halfway built and is moldering on the Subansiri River. All right, let me try to bring all this to a quick summary. In January, I went to Tamil Nadu, which is in southeast India, and I found a totally different country at work. India has canceled its major UMPP program, Ultra Mega Power Program. In 2005, they proposed to build 16 4,000 megawatt coal-fired power plants. They built 2. They've canceled the rest. And I went to Cheyur in Tamil Nadu to talk to people about why that was happening. And Cheyur was one of the 2 places in Tamil Nadu was going to have one of these big plants. It's not there. What is there? What is in Tamil Nadu? Last year, the state opened up one of the largest photovoltaic plants in the world, 648 megawatt photovoltaic plants. And Tamil Nadu has 7,500 megawatts of wind power. Why is that happening in Tamil Nadu? Well, one reason is that Narendra Modi and his energy secretary, Piyush Goyal, have a huge renewable energy program underway in India. They want to develop 225 new gigawatts of electrical energy in India between now and 2027. It's the second largest renewable energy program in the world, but next to China, and it's being driven by drought. India's ability to develop coal-fired power is being limited by how much water is in rivers needed to cool its coal-fired power plants. And India is putting coal-fired power plants in abeyance. India's imports of coal are down about 40% since 2018. Imports by month, and the increase in the production of coal is slowing. And India is making a very significant pivot on coal. Away from coal. So last year, India added about 13,000 megawatts of new electrical energy. 13,000. 7,500 megawatts of that 13,000 was from renewable sources. Renewable sources, solar and wind, that don't need water to operate. This is a huge, huge change. It's one of the good news stories on the Earth today. The IEA last December announced that coal production has peaked in the world in 2013, has been declining 1 to 2% since. In January, they announced that that emissions of CO2 have finally peaked and are starting to come down every year. And a lot of this has to do with what's happening in China and India and the United States. This is one of the really important good news stories. And in terms of water, energy is the second largest user of water in India and the second largest user of water globally. And for India to make this pivot this quickly is so significant. And the fact that Narendra Modi is emerging as a global leader now in climate change and economic development around sustainable goals is remarkable to me. And that's what I found out. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michael Kugelman, who will speak to us about water security in Pakistan.
Thanks, Claudia. Thank you to David, WWF, and thank you to Roger Mark and ECSP. It's always a pleasure to be here, in particular with my ECSP colleagues. I probably had the shortest commute of any of the panelists today, 2 floors down. So Keith had a number of good news stories to tell about India, and unfortunately, turning to Pakistan, there's going to be a lot of bad news stories. First off, not to be too melodramatic, but I would contend that water scarcity is a nightmare scenario that is all too real and all but inevitable in Pakistan. It's an IMF report that came out about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, and it found that Pakistan has the world's 4th highest rate of water use. Its water intensity rate, which is the amount of water used per unit of GDP, is one of the world's highest. The IMF also found that Pakistan's per capita annual water availability is 1,017 cubic meters, which is perilously close to the scarcity threshold of 1,000 cubic meters. And just much more recently, a few months ago, a UN report came out with a similar estimate of 1,014 cubic meters. Meanwhile, NASA satellite data of the world's underground aquifers has revealed that the aquifer in the Indus Basin, whose rivers and tributaries constitute Pakistan's chief water source, is the 2nd most stressed in the world. So this essentially means rapid depletion with little or no sign of recharge. Now, groundwater is, as you all know, it's critical stuff. I mean, it's essentially the last resort for water security. It's what we tap into when surface supplies run dry. And yet in Pakistan, this is a safety net that's essentially fraying. So, in effect, Pakistan is voraciously consuming water even as water tables are plummeting precipitously. So it's not a good scene. So, what are the challenges associated with Pakistan's water situation? I'll briefly identify 8 of them, which also effectively double as the core drivers of Pakistan's water crisis. Many of these are quite obvious and apply in other countries as well. They don't all apply in other places, particularly the last one, which I'll get to. Population growth, above all. There's been a major strain on supply because of the robust demand of a rapidly growing population, which now numbers close to 200 million people. A census has long been overdue in Pakistan, so there are no clear figures. But according to the UN estimates that many of us look at, we're looking at a population of nearly 200 million people. Pakistan's annual population growth rate is around 1.8%, and it's projected to stay over 1% until at least 2030. Second challenge, climate change. Pakistan is arguably one of the most climate vulnerable countries in South Asia, if not the world. Oftentimes we talk about Bangladesh in that context. Pakistan is right up there. The Western Himalayan region has experienced rapid glacial melting in recent years, with glacial thinning of up to 1 meter per year. The government in Pakistan has claimed that glacial melt on Pakistan's mountains has increased by nearly 25% in recent years. Now, this obviously has major implications because the Western Himalayan glaciers feed the waters of the Indus Basin, which is essentially Pakistan's chief water source. It's climate change that helps explain why the Indus River, the once mighty Indus River, has slowed to essentially a trickle in parts of the southern province of Sindh, which has compelled many impoverished farmers and also fishermen to move to the cities to seek non-water-focused livelihoods. Third challenge is agriculture. As in much of South Asia, agriculture is a key contributor to the economy. It consumes a very large majority of Pakistan's water supply, about 90%, and yet it consumes this water very inefficiently. It's been estimated that Pakistan's crop productivity per unit of water is 0.13 kilograms per cubic meter, which is quite low, to say the least. A fourth challenge associated with water in Pakistan is a lack of healthy infrastructure. Pakistan is unfortunately rather notorious for its leaky, dilapidated pipes, canals, and dams. Back in the 50s and the 60s, the international community heavily funded construction of a number of large infrastructure projects, including the Tarbela Dam. And yet in recent years, Pakistan has really struggled to make very urgent repairs. So as a result, the Tarbela Dam's lost a whopping 30% of its storage capacity since the late 1970s. And its total dam storage, Pakistan's total dam storage, constitutes only 30 days of average demand. And by contrast, in India, the figure is about 220 days. You also have problems with canals leaking, which leads to tremendous waste. Fifth challenge associated with water in Pakistan leads from the fourth one, water inefficient state policies. I just mentioned the ability or the unwillingness to make needed repairs to infrastructure. And I think you could add to that problematic policy this. The government in Pakistan has traditionally subsidized the most water-guzzling form of agriculture, known as flood irrigation. It's obviously an irrigation method that keeps the water flowing all the time. And of course, this is what you have in India as well. The state has been relatively slow to pick up on the merits of more water-efficient drip irrigation. There have been some private sector efforts to get into this space, which I can get into later. The state in Pakistan has also subsidized the production of some of the more water-intensive crops, such as sugar. And this is particularly salient given that the current government in Pakistan is run by a family that has major business stakes in the sugar industry. More broadly, the Pakistani government does not ignore water problems by any means, but it has not come out with any sort of comprehensive policy to tackle the water issue. And unfortunately, one of the major water-related agencies, the Water and Power Development Authority, is known for being rather ineffective. Sixth challenge is dirty water. Large amounts of Pakistan's water is polluted, thanks in no small part to the fact that the country has few, if any, wastewater treatment facilities. And the statistics about dirty water, polluted water, are really quite heartbreaking. Among other tragedies, dirty water kills more than 600 Pakistani children every day. Nearly 40,000 of them under 5 die from it every year. So what this means is that already precious water supplies are made more precious by the reality that much of what's still available is polluted and not fit for consumption. A seventh challenge associated with water is awareness, or lack of awareness. Civil society in Pakistan has done a tremendous job of bringing attention to water insecurity and the need to be judicious, or more judicious, in terms of consumption habits. You also have efforts in rural areas to use radio, which is a very powerful medium, there to highlight the challenges of water problems and the need to be judicious. There are also frequent academic conferences in major cities about water. But across the board, you still have many folks that either don't know or don't care about the water problems in the country, and this is reflected in consumption habits, which are often wasteful. Finally, eighth challenge is perhaps the most important, and here is where Pakistan diverges a bit from other countries, particularly in the developing world, when it comes to major challenges associated with water. The best way to describe this is the deeply unequal power structures that quite frankly, make life miserable for the masses and hamper their ability to access basic services, including water resources. I think one of the more troubling examples of this is in Sindh province, where you have very inequitable land ownership policies in which a small elite controls huge expanses of land. You have many landless folks who struggle to access the water that's found on the land controlled by these elites. And this is a manifestation of what many describe as feudal-like conditions that predominate in many areas, many rural areas of Pakistan, particularly Sindh, which happens to be one of Pakistan's driest provinces. And it's been said that land ownership is a proxy for water rights in Pakistan. If you don't own land, your right to water is highly tenuous. And these wealthy landlords seemingly go out of their way to undermine water security. I should say many of these wealthy landlords are tied to government, folks in parliament, and so forth. In the summer of 2010, when Pakistan was hit by some catastrophic flooding, some of these landowners actually diverted floodwater so that it moved away from their land and onto the modest plots overseen by their tenants or other landless folks. Now let me identify something that I do not believe poses a challenge for Pakistan in the water context, even though many Pakistanis will rigorously assume that it does, and that's India. In Pakistan, many people, including anti-India terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, accuse India, which is Pakistan's upstream rival, of essentially plugging up water and keeping it from flowing down into Pakistan, thereby depleting river flows into Pakistan. Certainly this is a hypothetical possibility. It could happen, but there's really no evidence to suggest that India is actively preventing water from coming into Pakistan. The dams that India has constructed are run of the river, meaning they don't store significant amounts of water. So in this regard, India is probably more of a convenient scapegoat than a genuine explanation for or challenge associated with Pakistan's water insecurity. The broader reality is that there's actually been a fair level of cooperation between these two enemies in managing transboundary water resources in the Indus Basin. And a key reason for this is the Indus Waters Treaty. Many of you know what the IWT is. It's nearly a 60-year-old agreement that governs how India and Pakistan manage the Indus River Basin's rivers and tributaries. Long been seen as a success story because while India and Pakistan have fought several wars, they've never fought a war over water. Not yet. The significant thing about the IWT is that it allocates 3 rivers each to Pakistan and India, but Pakistan is given control of the Indus Basin's 3 large western rivers. the Indus, the Jhelum, and the Chenab, which account for 80% of the water in the entire basin. Now, Pakistan often claims that it is disadvantaged by the IWT, but in fact, the IWT does give it control over the vast majority of the Indus Basin's river flows, which perhaps was an effort to compensate for the fact that Pakistan is inherently vulnerable as the lower riparian. So the IWT is the chief tool of transboundary water management in the Indus Basin, but it certainly is threatened by several factors. Two of them are climate change and population growth. Obviously, when the treaty was drawn up in 1950, it wasn't able to take into account climate change effects and population growth that both countries have experienced, and which obviously puts more of a strain on both countries' water resources. So there have been voices on both sides of the border that have called for the treaty to be renegotiated. My own view is that there is not enough cooperation in the India-Pakistan relationship. There's not enough trust to allow for renegotiation. We can get into this later. And the other major factors that imperil effective transboundary water management in the Indus Basin are politics and security. I mean, the deep tensions between India and Pakistan, which have grown even more fraught over the last year or two, I would contend may well threaten the viability of the IWT. Many of you will recall that last year, India's government hinted that it could retaliate for terrorist attacks on the Indian army, attacks that New Delhi believes were carried out by terrorists with ties to Pakistani intelligence, by revoking the IWT treaty altogether. So in reality, India is very unlikely to do this. I can go into why later. But the fact that India has even hinted at taking such a drastic measure, I think, raises some alarm bells, given that the IWT has lasted for so long, even through multiple wars between the two countries. So the essential point here, and I'll wrap up here, is that water is very deeply intertwined with long-standing political disputes between India and Pakistan. It is 100% wrong to claim that water is a soft issue in India-Pakistan relations and that the two sides can use water cooperation as a confidence-building measure to build trust. It certainly is not that easy, and that's because water is deeply intertwined with the Kashmir issue. The rivers of the Indus Basin flow through Kashmir, the contested region that's triggered several India-Pakistan wars. And when Pakistan accuses India of stealing Pakistan's water and preventing it from flowing downstream, Pakistanis often assert that the only way to stop Indian water theft is to liberate Jammu and Kashmir, a region of Kashmir controlled by India that Pakistan has always claimed. So in effect, you cannot separate transboundary water management from the ugly, complex political disputes in India-Pakistan relations. There's really nothing apolitical about transboundary water management on the Indian subcontinent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll turn now to Roger Mark, who will speak to us about water scarcity, ethnic conflict, and security in Mindanao, the Philippines, after which we'll begin a discussion.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I'm going to remain seated, and I actually have a PowerPoint because I wanted to show you some images, but I wanted to talk to you this afternoon about there being more to the Philippines if you're looking at developing peace in the country and what it means specifically in terms of water. And I thought of this framing when I saw a blog post from Peter Lee in his China Matters blog spot, where he really talks about there being more to the Philippines. He says that it should be clear that there's more to the Philippines than Manila, more to its politics and society than upper-class Catholicism, more to its security concerns than partnering with the United States to push back against the People's Republic of China in the South China Sea. There's Mindanao, there's Moros, there's separatism, there's issues of justice that have been papered over by the Manila establishment to present a neat neoliberal narrative that complements the US pivot to Asia, and there's Duterte. So there's a lot going on. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can navigate the complexity of issues in Mindanao and the degree to which that serves as a piece of the peace dividend in the Philippines, and to talk about that in three general areas. I'd like to start by talking about the three M's: the specificity of Mindanao, Moros, the Muslim population, and a morality perspective that infuses those in the region. I'd like to talk a little bit about the impacts. So what? Why should we care? And ultimately, what does this mean for us here in the United States, which is part of the framing that we have in the case studies that we have in the book. Why is it of interest to us here in the United States? So we know that the Philippines is so much more than Manila. Mindanao is in the southern part. It's Mindanao, which many of you know is one of 3 island groupings in the Philippines, with Luzon and the Visayas that make up the Philippines. It's to the south, but it's also Muslim Mindanao, which includes the island of Mindanao and many smaller outlying islands that includes 5 predominantly Muslim provinces that make up the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao arm. So we are very familiar with this region in Mindanao. But for me, when I think of the water conflict dynamics, ultimately, for me, it's a Mindanao thing. And what do I mean by it being a Mindanao thing? It's the specificity of the issues that we see in Mindanao that's tied to its location and what that means in terms of water resources and natural resource management, what it means in terms of the fight for autonomy from the central government in the Philippines, what's happening with regard to the water resources and how it's managed. It's the economic isolation of Mindanao. It's the political weight that Mindanao carries politically in the Philippines, the weight that it carries politically, but also implications that it has for the geopolitics of the region and what's happening in the context of changing climatic and environmental conditions. So Mindanao is the farming and agricultural core of the Philippines. Over 40% of the jobs in the region are in the agricultural sector, and Mindanao accounts for about 14% of the nation's GDP. This is being affected by droughts. Droughts brought on by the effects of El Nino and heavy monsoons from La Nina are causing some very severe agricultural disruptions and making the area fairly unusable and unstable. Of the country's 5 principal water basins, one is located in the Mindanao River Basin. So Mindanao overall hosts over 260 watersheds, and the National Power Corporation operates and manages 3 dams in Mindanao that has a capacity of roughly 28 million cubic meters. So it's important, and these issues weigh on the politics of the region. When it interacts with climatic change and impacts on the natural resources, we know that it has affected the degree to which the local population is mobilizing. Politically, Mindanao experiences higher voter turnout in most elections, and one researcher was able to note that in the 2004 general election, that one of the provinces witnessed the highest voter turnout in the entire country at 89%, which led to overwhelming support of the incumbent President Arroyo and was a determining factor in her re-election. So politically, Mindanao carries a lot of weight and is quite significant. Then there are the Moros. So the indigenous peoples, or Lumad, are the original inhabitants of Mindanao, and there are about 35 tribes. The Moro population, which is comprised mostly of the Muslim population, is about 13 ethnic groups. And then the most recent settlers are the Christians from Luzon and Visayas. And there continues to be lots of contentions between these groups, a lot of conflicts between them, the MILF, the central government of the Philippines, and the Moro people of Mindanao. So a conflict-ridden area, and you can't see this is quite well, but this shows a timeline of conflict in Mindanao starting in 1969 when the New People's Army and the Moro National Liberation Front was formed, to today where there's a peace deal and negotiations around that. So what we try to do is have a sense in the chapter the degree to which these issues are perceived from a water security lens, and the degree to which the population sees this from an intergenerational justice morality lens. So if you look at this photograph, you see a young boy really engaging in some of the military forces here. And many of the water dynamics are perceived in the region from an ethnic point of view, from an intergenerational point of view, and from a justice perspective. And we know that we see this in Mindanao, particularly when we look at issues around drought. So in April 2016, drought drove some 6,000 hungry farmers and their families to Kidapawan City to demand food assistance. Thousands protesting in the streets. 2 people were killed. There was a lot of instability and conflict at a local level. Zamboanga City has also been struggling with a 3-year drought and has had to ration its water as a result. And that has also led to some conflict, and there's some projects with USAID trying to have a sense of how they can manage that. We also see this in terms of energy production, water insecurity, and questions around land tenure. So this graph shows some of the water levels of the hydropower sources in Mindanao. And there are many grievances around the development of these water resources and proposed dams, particularly one on the largest river, tributary of the largest river in Mindanao. So for the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, they see this as an attempt by the government to extract oil and gas from one of the prominent marshes, as the dam would drain the marsh and make the area drillable. So they see this directly as an affront to their well-being, and they have actually claimed this area as part of their ancestral domain, which the government is not recognizing. So you have this interaction of questions of land tenure, ancestral domain claims, economic development, and what it means to indigenous rights, conflict, and water resources, which is very prevalent in the region. We also examine this in the context of impact on other sectors on water resources. So this is from the front page of Mindanao Daily News, and you see after clearing Zambo City's conflict zone, they're back to the barracks, but just below it, water crisis hits thousands in their households. So really a very much a lot of visibility between the connection between these issues. So what we found in the case study is that even in those instances where water resources are not directly impacted, it trickles over into other sectors and leads to conflict and instability at various levels. We see this more particularly when there's prolonged fighting in certain areas, or when there are disasters, when people are displaced. So a lot of communities and people are being displaced, and when they are in temporary shelters, they are very often not able to get clean water for their needs. So there's a lot going on. It's quite complex. It's driven by water resources, climatic changes, and then on top of all of this, there's Duterte. So, and then part of Duterte's positioning around these issues, and in his interaction with the Japanese government, he most recently in 2012 was directly challenging the US position in Mindanao. We will survive. Without the assistance of America, maybe a lesser quality of life, but as I said, we will survive. And what we know is that Duterte won the elections on a promise to combat what he referred to as imperial Manila and imperialist foreigners. So his platform was on sustainable peace, constitutional reform, and development of the countryside. So of course, this is complicated by his involvement with extrajudicial killing of criminals and drug laws in Davao. And of course, as we have heard the reports, he's said to be close to the former dictator, Marcos. So there are two persistent factors that positions Duterte in this water conflict-driven area. And the first is the absence of rule of law. So political and social institutions are deemed to be ineffective, and the judicial system is both ineffective and corrupt. And this has exacerbated what is known in the region as Rido or clan violence, which may persist over generations. The second is the lingering impact of Marcos, who brought to the region state sanctions, politicized violence against those sectors of the society that were opposed to government politics. So quite a complicated scene on a number of levels. And what has been the result? So what? What has been the impact of this today? So when we look back at Mindanao's conflict in numbers, it's been going on for 47 years. 4 million people on average are displaced. We have 21 foreigners who were kidnapped in 2015. Two of the most wanted people in terms of radical Islam are said to be in the area. They're number 2 on the US terrorist list. So this is in terms of looking at US political interests and US strategic interests, Mindanao is quite significant. On a local level, what are we seeing in terms of impacts? And all of the chapters in the book do this analysis where we call a paths of influence, where we try to have a sense of how do we look at this in terms of the social, the societal context, ecological change, the impact and the effect on human systems, what does it mean for how we respond as human beings, what are the feedback loops, the feedback mechanisms, and how does this ultimately relate to US interests? So each of the chapters in the book go through this kind of analysis. So this is a snapshot for what we have in the book on this chapter in Mindanao. So ultimately, where does that leave us? What does this mean? Strategic implications for US national interests continue to be important, particularly from the perspective of the 3 Ds: development, defense, diplomacy. We know that the US strategic interests in the region, particularly around the South China Sea and the disputed Spratly Islands, of course looking at what it means in terms of oil reserves and China's claims on the region, what it means in terms of defense. In 2014, the United States and the Philippines signed an enhanced defense cooperation agreement, which allows the United States to rotate troops into the Philippines. Duterte opposes this. He fights this. This was part of his platform in the elections. And finally, from a diplomacy perspective, since 2001, Mindanao has been part of what the US security circles are referred to as the second front in the war on terror, with the US Joint Special Operations Task Force in the Philippines combating Islamic groups. So there's quite a lot going on that makes Mindanao particularly salient and interesting in terms of US implications and our US strategic interests. So finally, what does this mean in terms of how we engage and think about the peace dividends that we can get through water in this conflict affected area? Ultimately, in the chapter, we talk about using water programs as point of entries to invest in peace building and climate resilience. And we talked about this in the context of recognizing the persistence of conflict, the saliency of natural resources, and the state of underdevelopment. So very much, as Claudia, you were saying, your focus is on the development potential. This is very much the approach that we talk about. We talk about the importance, and this builds on some of the work that we had seen coming out of the World Bank and others, are looking at trust among stakeholders, including the local actors, the national government, and the international aid group, and then the opportunities from a U.S. security perspective to think about what are the opportunities to link defense, diplomacy, and development efforts, particularly in the context of water management programs, recognizing that this spills over into the humanitarian and climate assistance perspectives and realms also. So quite a challenging, nuanced environment, but we think that there's some opportunities to build on water diplomacy to really harness the potential of the peace dividend in Mindanao. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger Mark. I'd like to begin a bit of a discussion now. We've had three fascinating and very different types of takes on this question of how water and security dynamics play into one another. What I'll do now is I'll ask each one of our panelists a first brief question, which will give all of you time to think of your questions. Then we'll open up for audience questions, and when we do, we'll have volunteers holding a microphone to remind you that we're being both live cast and recorded, so it's important to speak into the microphone and arguably important to choose your words carefully. For all of those reasons, when you do ask your questions, please identify yourself, and then also identify if there's a particular speaker you would like to address your questions to, or feel free just to address questions to the panel. I'll take perhaps 3 at a time when we move to the audience. To begin, though, I'd like to ask each one of our speakers a question. I'll begin in order with Keith. Keith told us, I thought, a very interesting story of the shift he had seen in the power mix in India over time, from one that was very vulnerable to water availability and also very climate damaging, toward one that was more climate benign, but also much more water secure. Solar, wind, the new renewables clearly are much less vulnerable to water security issues. I'm curious about the policy drivers that you felt you saw behind that shift. Obviously, there are economic issues, there are political issues and positioning, as you were saying, in terms of India taking the stage in the climate debates, and then there are also straight concerns over the ability to ensure water availability for either thermal cooling or for hydropower. So I'm curious if you could just speak to us a little bit about how you saw the policy motivations behind this shift, and also given the context of the U.S. interests across the region and the topic, whether you felt there was any indication that the U.S.-India partnership may have had any influence in the thinking and the policy drivers that led to this more water-conscious energy mix.
I'll try to be brief. There's a lot of resource pieces of this. In order for India to produce 1 billion metric tons of coal, which is where Modi started, given from the last previous administration, in order for India to achieve that, they'd have to get that coal out of protected forests. And people live in those protected forests. So the political dynamic and the social conflict that would come from having India try to expand its coal base on a domestic front would be enormous. Secondly, to import coal, India was heading to 200 million metric tons. Is a tremendous drain on their treasury, so that's one. Two, they have significant water resource supply problems and overabundance problems. So in the Himalayas, too much water. It's damaging their hydropower. Hydropower in the Himalayas has basically come to a standstill because the Himalayas, the most unstable mountain range in the world, is even more unstable. They have earthquakes now they have to deal with. So building a 1,000 megawatt hydropower dam in the Himalayas has gotten to be much more expensive and much more difficult to manage. And so, and people don't want it. As I said, there's 100 million more people in the Himalayas than there were 30 years ago, so there's a lot of people in the way to move for these dams and the backwaters. Water issues in the rest of the country are very significant. India's had 2.5 years of very serious drought that closed coal-fired power plants. When I was in Tamil Nadu, the 1,000 megawatt power plant in Tuticorin closed because it didn't have enough water in the river that is used to cool it. So there's that significance. And then on the renewable side, Modi just recognizes the job-generating growth of it. I mean, renewable energy can be one of India's new important growth strategies. It already employs almost as many people as the coal sector, which is 350,000 people in the coal sector. India started an international research institute. Modi started an international solar research institute with the help of the French during the Paris Climate Accord, which is now in Delhi, which is and significant U.S. help there under the Obama administration, which is principally designed to generate the technology and the practices and the equipment so that India can become a solar power, a giant like China. So you have all those three, and the pieces in the increase in generating capacity, and this is really important. India generates now about 307 gigawatts of electrical generating capacity total. We generate 1,000 gigawatts. China generates 1,150. But India's capacity to increase the generating, the amount of electricity they need to be the Western-style development power in the world, to get to 1,000 megawatts, 1,000 gigawatts or more, they're only adding 12 gigawatts a year, maybe 14, depending upon which year, sometimes 18. But we're talking about 60 years away from generating 1,000 gigawatts of power. And India, ecologically, is going to be a much different place in 60 years. Punjab and Haryana could be dry. Mumbai could be under 10 feet of water, along with Kolkata, right? The forest could be dry. The mountains, Modi recognizes all of this conflicting ecological, economic trends, and they're converging at the same time. And what's been so surprising to me is how quickly they can adjust to it. That's the important piece. In 2012, I didn't see any adjustments like this. In 2017, I saw all kinds of adjustments that lead us to the point where India, for the first time in hundreds of years, is a major factor in global dynamics about economy, ecology, climate, and the world's security. And when was India played that role? I don't know, 1,000 years ago, maybe?
Thank you, Keith. A question to Michael. Michael, you spoke to us about both the chronic water scarcity in Pakistan, these increasing shocks, the terrible floods that they had suffered, the sort of inevitable disruption that may attend the over-exploitation of groundwater in the country. And I'm very curious, you spoke briefly about the migration implications that this water insecurity may create, both migration rural to urban areas, or within regions of the country, or even regionally outside the country or globally. I'm curious if you would just speak to us a little bit more about the implications that chain of events would have on stability within Pakistan and security, and whether there are actions or enough social awareness to try to forestall some of that disruption through better water management.
Yeah, thank you. So there's been rural to urban migration, and I think what we really have to worry about is the urban to rural migration. I mean, the rural to urban migration is, again, it's not particularly unique, and these are things that are happening elsewhere, other parts of the world. The climate change is causing water resources to really dry up, particularly in areas of Sindh, where farming had been a really big deal, leading generally the men, the husbands, the fathers, to go find other sources of livelihood in cities. Problem here is that Pakistani cities are growing very rapidly. Pakistan has one of the largest urbanization rates in Asia. I think it's 3% is its urbanization rate right now. So you have problems where you have uprootings on a very local household level because the men are leaving, they're going to cities, and they're having a lot of trouble finding jobs and shelter and other things like that in cities. And that puts a lot of strain on municipal authorities to provide these types of services, which they can't do. And this intensifies what already are some pretty significant levels of dire privation in cities. And that then, you can't draw causation out of this, but there are reasons, it's good reason to worry that you keep having all these people come into these cities and their basic needs not accounted for. You certainly have to worry about radicalization prospects. Now, the flip side, urban to rural, here I'd focus on Karachi. Karachi is the big mega city in Pakistan. It's located on the coast in the south, very susceptible to cyclones, tsunamis, etc. So there's reason to worry that as climate change, its effects intensify, and you start to have these storms with more regularity, given how weak infrastructure is in Karachi, you have to worry that if these storms and these major weather events start happening significantly, you could have people leaving the cities and going back into the rural areas. And if you look at the sources of unrest and violence in Karachi, there are many. But one of them is that people tend to, you have a lot of criminal gangs and mafias that fight over land, over precious land resources. And obviously, with climate change related effects, it's going to wipe away, or is wiping away some of this land, meaning that the land that's there is becoming even more precious. When it's becoming more precious, that means that the stakes could go up and people could be more inclined to use violence to protect the land that's there. And if the violence levels go up, this could induce more folks leaving Karachi and going outside. At this point, it's too early to tell what this could mean for stability on a more large-scale level, but I think that the potential is, as I said before, the radicalization concerns in the urban space.
Thank you, Michael. So, Roger Mark, you had a very national perspective that you shared with us on the Philippines, really the national geopolitics, which are, I think, particularly complicated in an island nation like the Philippines, where you do get such a segmented political economy in different places, if you will. And you really spoke to us about the implications of rule of law, history of dictatorship, on the way in which policies to either deal with water intentionally or incidentally really affect the fragility of nations. And I was just hoping that you might be able to draw out some of the positive lessons for us. Are there ways, we've seen, you've told so many clear stories of the ways in which this led to hardship and greater fragility. Are there lessons of encouragement here about ways in which water management institutions, and I mean institutions broadly, not just agencies, but water rights, incentives, enforcement mechanisms, water development programs could help to balance rather than deepen the inequalities that drive divisions in economies and cultures?
I'm glad that you asked that question. It's not all despair. So yes, I think there are a number of initiatives within Mindanao that are coming both from those working on water security, WASH initiatives, and also humanitarian and development organizations. So for example, USAID has a project called Be Secure, where specifically it's looking at developing the capacity of local actors to track, monitor, and deal with water loss, inefficient use, but we're not seeing as yet that project is bringing in the conflict dimension. So together with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, we had helped develop a water and conflict toolkit that is now being shared with the USAID missions, that has outlined a set of do no harm principles around water conflict management and mitigation. And we hope that those would be implemented in Mindanao and elsewhere. There have been some successful efforts in looking at the degree to which water projects allow for women to be involved in peace building efforts. So there are some innovations around that.
Excellent, thank you. So I'd like to open up now to questions. Again, just to remind you, we'll be passing around microphones. Please identify yourself and the speaker that you want to direct your question to, if you have a particular speaker in mind. Begin with the woman in the front row and work our way backward into
Thank you.
I'll be taking about 3 questions at a time, please.
My name is Nicole DePaul. I'm Executive Director of Global Health Asia Institute. It's a think tank in Bangkok. So thank you for all the panelists. I think my question is for Michael. You mentioned the big problem of awareness. And is there any room for improving communication and the narrative? I think, Keith, you touched upon some of the good stories, and especially the theme of security that could raise fear, and it's hard to communicate. So do you have anything in mind that could make the role of researchers better communicators on this issue to raise awareness? Thank you.
Terrific. We'll take 3 just behind. Steve?
Yeah, it's Steve Solomon. I'm an author of a book now rather dated called Water. I wanted to ask both, I think I'll direct this maybe to Claudia as well, if you can be included in the answer, Michael and Keith, to really talk about some of the cross-border issues on the 2 major river basins, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. Both the Ganges in the context of maybe the failure of the hydropower projects and the previous efforts that had been made in the cooperation with Nepal and the rest. And the Brahmaputra has many issues, but also interested in the Chinese angle there as well in terms of development that they have and diversion possibilities.
Terrific. Maybe we'll take these other 2 questions on the side there and then break for answers. The young woman, yes? Didn't you had your hand raised, yes?
Yes.
Yes, please. And 2 behind you, I believe.
Okay.
Yes.
So my question is, I'm Chloe Thompson. I work at the American Foreign Policy Council. My question is also for Mr. Kugelman, but I was wondering if you could talk more about why you don't think India will pull out of IWT, and what do you see in the future for IWT moving forward? Thanks.
The gentleman with the glasses.
My name is Trey Taylor. I'm a founder of a marine renewable energy company. We have projects that range from New York City's East River to Zimbabwe's Zambezi River. Our technologies produce clean energy and water at the same time. So my question to you, and for all of you, I thought you've done a wonderful job of identifying the problem. So what's the solution? How do we go at this? And one of the things we're seeing in all of our projects is how important it is for government, business, and finance to be working together. Because it is economic arguments we need to be made to address these problems. So my thought is, can we reverse it? In other words, might we be pushing toward, rather than public-private partnerships, private-public partnerships that begin at the local level rather than the top level? In other words, empowering the local community, getting on a path towards sustainability, and pushing up.
So let's go ahead and answer this set of very rich questions, and maybe we'll begin with Michael, and then Keith and Roger Mark, please add.
Sure, thanks. I'm not sure I'll answer all those questions, but I'll highlight a few quick points on some of them. First, to the question of the IWT and where India could go with that. The reason why I think it's unlikely that India would revoke the treaty, several. One is that it would take a very long time for India to actually follow through and start building dams and cutting off water supplies to Pakistan. Obviously, it would take a lot of money, a lot of time, and in India, things take a long time to happen in general. So that's one reason. Secondly, it would be very dangerous for India because of the geography of India. If it were to start building these really big dams in ways that would allow India to keep water from flowing downstream, it could actually cause a lot of flooding inside India. And I don't think India wants to deal with that problem when it has problems with floods to start with. Another thing is that I think the world would really go against India. It would oppose India if it were to do that, particularly because the IWT is an internationally mediated treaty. The World Bank is a co-signer. And India, as it continues on its path to trying to become a rising power, it would not want to have to generate opprobrium from the international community. And also, finally, it wouldn't solve the problem that would be intended to solve. I think one of the major reasons why India has threatened to revoke the IWT is to essentially put pressure on Pakistan to cut down on cross-border terrorism. And honestly, I think if India were to take such a drastic step or it announced it was stepping out of the treaty, if anything, it would impel Pakistan to double down on maintaining its ties to these groups on its soil that threaten India. In terms of the question about improving communication in water security to raise awareness is a good question. As I said before, there actually is a lot of really impressive stuff happening on civil society levels, and particularly, certainly in urban areas, but even more importantly in rural areas where radio, which is the big thing that people still listen to in many of these rural parts of Pakistan, you have these shows that actually talk about the need to conserve. Many of them focus on women as well, which is important. But I would say that one area to be looking at is to be trying to, any type of communication strategy needs to target key stakeholders, which is a cliched term, but in this context, it means the folks that really have the power and pull the strings to make more happen on a policy level. And in Pakistan, that's the military, quite frankly, which has always been the most powerful entity. The military has a very large economic empire. It has these huge businesses and cereal, construction, all types of things. It all requires a lot of water. So if there could be efforts to try to get the military to realize the fact that water insecurity could affect its own economic interests, maybe that could get things moving in a good direction.
Keith or Roger Mark, would you like to add to any of the questions that were asked?
I'd like to jump in on the communications and then the solutions piece. So I was in Tamil Nadu and saw some really interesting communications among young people using social media and video and music videos to communicate very sophisticated kinds of ideas. One music video became viral in Tamil Nadu that was dealing with contaminated water and toxic waste from a mercury factory that had closed in the 80s. And to get this project, to get the compensation to the workers, the NGO community asked a young rapper, a woman rapper, to help them. And so she did a rap to a Nicki Minaj song about this issue. And it went viral. And it changed the entire course of the events. And the company, Unilever, came to the table to settle for compensation over this one video. So it's possible to think in different kinds of media that's available now for us in the 21st century and for young people to be able to distill these ideas. And distillation is so important for this complexity because this isn't Bruno Mars. This is really hard stuff to deal with. On the solutions piece, what I'm seeing is that the same trends that I talk about mega development and all of the impediments to it also affect the renewable sector. And I'm seeing distributed and scale becoming very important to this debate. Why do we need a 648 megawatt solar power plant in Tamil Nadu that takes up an ocean of space? I mean, it's in the desert and there aren't a lot of people there. But, Bangladesh in 2010, don't hold me to that date, but let's just call it 2010, proposed to build 19 coal-fired power plants, 19 of them. And in order to build a coal-fired power plant in Bangladesh, you got to move 20,000 people out of the way, right? Because it takes 500, 600, 800 hectares of land. You need the plant, you need the coal pile, you need all that infrastructure. And so all those coal plants are under serious social opposition. Japan has pulled out of the one it was going to finance. China pulled out the one it's going to finance. South Korea pulled out of the one it's going to finance. It's in abeyance. India is now like the last one in Nepal. But what Bangladesh did to replace it was rooftop solar. And they have one of the best rooftop solar programs in the world. And that seems to me to be a really reasonable response to the issue of scale. Because I don't think the world is going to, I certainly don't think the United States is going to accept 10 million windmills, right? And how many square miles of solar panels under existing technology. But I think that we will accept eagerly scaled projects like that are happening in California now, where houses are being built with the solar equipment and the solar capacity in as part of the package. And it's turnkey stuff, right? That's the only place I've seen in the world that's happening, but I think if it's happening in California, it can happen everywhere.
Thanks, Keith. I think one of the other angles of this sort of less centralized, more agile response to service provision that relates to water is the opportunity to be much more inclusive and targeted for purposes of stability. So if you don't have to have one centralized, whatever sort of plant it is, wastewater, power, et cetera, but can disperse these at appropriate scales, you also have the opportunity to disperse services and be much more targeted and inclusive in ways that can promote stability. But Roger, Mark, any thoughts on this?
Sure, I was going to share the story of a colleague from Mindanao who I met with a few years ago, who told me about a really innovative project that was occurring at a very local level. It was through a Muslim woman's cooperative, and they had gotten the permission from the men in their community to meet and discuss. And what they decided that they were going to do was reinterpret verses from the Quran from an environmental stewardship ethic, including water resources. So they found this safe space where they could meet and share and support each other, and the men allow them to do this, and they came out with key messages that they got the imam to then use in his sermons. And it created a space where these Muslim women could then engage as stewards of the environment. We don't hear enough of those stories coming out of Mindanao. So we work with Keith and others to get journalists to track and cover these kinds of stories. So what we hear in Mindanao from the humanitarian workers that we chat with is that there's a real dearth of information at a very localized level. And having these type of stories of innovation coming out at a community level helps fill the gaps in storytelling, but also helps convey some of what is possible and what could be done. And I would say for us, and particularly this is one of the purpose of the book, is to think about how do we talk about this in terms of U.S. strategic interests. So, you know, when you think of the current U.S. administration and positioning vis-a-vis Duterte has a lot of traction with the public. But if he were in the Philippines, but if he were to decide that he really wanted to sever relations with the United States, the military establishment in the Philippines will push back. Our countries have a tremendous long history of partnership. So just to say that there are opportunities to think about how we position these stories in terms of the existing historical relationship that is of value to both U.S. strategic interests, but also to Philippine, Pinoy interests, and the degree to which Mindanao resonates at a national level in the Philippines, how we message around that, given Mindanao's contributions, particularly in the agricultural sector and geopolitically. This is what this book aims to do, to help us think about positive, engaged messaging in that context.
I think we have time for two more quick questions. So I'm not sure whose hands were up first. I apologize. Let's take the two in the far corner. I apologize. We are available perhaps to speak afterward. But let's take these last two questions back here, and then we'll invite David up to close for us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting hearing the different dimensions of the three countries and how the security situation might overlap in it. My question is posed to Michael. I come from Pakistan. I'm a climate change campaigner there. I work for Islamic Relief. I'm here in the US studying the legislative process around how do you take climate sensitive policies to be incorporated in all the segments, whether it's water, whether it's electricity, whether it's public services, whether it's transportation. How do you do that? Now, when it comes to talking about Pakistan, I do agree to quite an extent in terms of how Pakistan needs a revitalization in terms of awareness raising, in terms of practices, in terms of governance systems, in terms of policies. But we hold the governments accountable for it. But there's one thing, I don't know if you guys missed to touch upon, or probably you guys touched upon it and I came in a bit late, was the accountability action to it. How are we ensuring the governments to be accountable, but at the same time, the international players who are funding programs, projects, interventions in the country, how are they accountable to it? I would just quote one example, Left Bank Outward Canal
Okay, if we can keep it to a question,
All right.
because we're actually.
So
over
this
time.
question is like, how do you ensure the accountability and transparency of the programs that are being funded by the international organizations?
And there was a young woman behind. I'm sorry. One more, thank you.
My name is Neha Sinha. I work for the Bombay Natural History Society, which is a conservation organization in India. My question for both Michael and Keith, if you'd care to answer. You've both spoken about the nexus between providing water to farmers and electricity, the fact that India doesn't have that much electricity to kind of give away. But I wondered how you interpreted the interaction between the moral call of giving water to farmers, given that farmers are a very important vote bank, and India is a socialist country. While all farmers may not be rich, there is a moral call to give water to them. How does that impact your understanding of this nexus between irrigation and electricity? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps this time we'll start with Keith and then move to Michael, in fairness.
The moral cause of giving water to farmers. But I don't think there's any dispute that water and farming is an essential link. But there also is probably a moral cause to not waste it, and not to pollute it, and not to engage in a system in which you're wasting water, you're wasting electricity, and you're producing enormous surpluses that go to waste. That's not a way. I think that's a moral. That's not a moral union you want to have. I think. So I don't. I think in Punjab and Haryana have got to come to terms with free water and free electricity, because it's producing a feedback loops that's hurting the economy of India. It's very inefficient and very wasteful. Maybe that's a Western view.
Open to discussion afterward as well. Michael.
Clearly, this is a big policy challenge when it comes to water resource management in Pakistan or India. Farmers are a key constituency, though at the same time, the fact that you have these policies that subsidize basically as much water as is needed for these folks, that obviously is going to have implications. And I've long argued that one of the major policy correctives that need to be adapted, or should be adapted, in Pakistan to deal with the water crisis is to come up with, to reform water pricing plans, which would entail charging people for the water that they actually use. But obviously that would have to be done very carefully on a scale where, those that make a lot less, those that you'd be paying essentially, those that are wealthy would be paying a lot more than those that are not wealthy. Obviously it's a very tough thing to pull off, but essentially I agree. The question of how to incorporate climate sensitive policies into water resource matters. Here I would just say that I think Pakistan, I wrote an article about this a few weeks ago, sort of a hidden success story in Pakistan, that there actually have been some really impressive efforts to deal with climate change. Pakistan actually has a national climate change policy. It doesn't have a national water policy or energy policy or anything like that, but it actually has a policy within an implementing framework. And there actually have been court decisions that have basically concluded that the government's not doing enough to keep to this governing framework associated with the climate strategy. So that's important. Finally, I realized that we, not intentionally, I'm sure, we didn't address Stephen's question earlier about, the China factor. All I'll say there is that I think another reason why India may not want to revoke the IWT is that it worries that China would try to retaliate by cutting off or doing things to prevent water from flowing, preventing the Brahmaputra River water from flowing into India, because China is an ally of Pakistan. I wouldn't want India to punish Pakistan by revoking the IWT. So there's an interesting triad effect there.
A final thought from Keith, and Roger Mark, if you have a final thought.
I would like to talk about the Philippines. I just returned from 2.5 weeks from the Philippines.
We're over time, though. I apologize.
And water was a huge piece of a story that I covered there, where Duterte, who has a very interesting kind of social quality policy, which is to ban smoking and to bloody the drug traffickers, also is a conservationist. And he had hired an environment secretary, an environmentalist, Gina Lopez, who went out and purposely began to order closures of big mines and watersheds. And water quality and water pollution and the effect on water supply was what drove her. And she ordered closures of 26 of their 41 big mines to protect those watersheds across the Mindanao and Luzon, the big islands there. And the question we had about how do you institute that in a governing process. You had the president appointing an environmentalist to do these things. She did these things, and last week she was dismissed from her job by the legislature, which is influenced by the mining industry, all right? So she got in place policy and law and orders to tame a rapacious industry, but she couldn't keep her job.
Roger, Mark, any final thoughts? Very well, then I'd like to invite David Reed back up to give us some closing remarks.
I want to thank the panelists in the audience. I think this has been a really great discussion. I think it's just begin touching the surface of many of the issues that are latent here. We found ourselves using terms of the rise of state fragility, loss of state legitimacy, the era of disruption, the rise of insurgency, not just rural to urban migration, but urban to rural migration, a whole set of concepts that are relatively new, and we're going to have to understand in much greater depth as we push forward in this world that is changing ever so rapidly, really beyond our comprehension. Now, I'm going to spare you because of reasons of time. I was going to give you a quick summary of our discussion. Fascinating summary that I had prepared for you. But of course, if you have a sense of how difficult it is trying to do a summary of 3 case studies, imagine what it's like trying to take 24 countries in 14 geographies to understand the dynamics of water security and its impacts on the United States interests around the world. I strongly recommend that you get a copy of the book, Water Security and U.S. Foreign Policy. It's a brilliant summary that you'll find therein. I say that in jest, but I do hope you'll join us in the launch of the book in about a month now. So with that, I'd like us to thank our panelists, to thank Claudia for a really exceptional discussion that opens the pathway for many more explorations in the future. So thank you ever so much.
Seeing a story.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.